Thank you, Aidan. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are here today. Welcome. It's great to see such a big turnout. As Aidan has already said, the John Weston Public Lecture is a biennial lecture that the School of Social Science and the Institute for Social Science Research organised to commemorate the contributions of John Weston. And what we do is we bring a leading social scientist to the university to speak on a topic that exemplifies the kind of social science that John Weston, my father, was such a strong sort of proponent of and advocate for. And previous lectures in this series have been given by sociologists, by criminologists, by economists, and they've touched on topics in international development and peace building, realistic utopian futures, economic and labour market challenges for the country, sociology of the law, legal profession and regulation. And those lectures, as I've said, have been given by an eminent national or international scholar from outside the University of Queensland. I'm particularly delighted that tonight the John Weston Public Lecture will be given by Professor Rhema Vaithianathan, an internationally recognised economist who heads the Centre for Social Data Analytics at Auckland University of Technology, but who also, as of, I'm not sure, a few weeks ago, is Professor of Social Data and Analytics at the Institute for Social Science Research here at the University of Queensland. Rhema's appointment is a central part of our strategic planning to build social data science at UQ in a way that harnesses the potential of tools like machine learning and artificial intelligence to do social good. The vision of the Institute for Social Science Research is to make a meaningful difference in people's lives, and we do this by partnering to carry out transformational research to solve critical social challenges. Scientific and technological advances and innovation are a key part of the solution to the hardest societal challenges, and emerging data analytics techniques like predictive risk modelling offer new opportunities to learn from data and to improve the delivery of services and products to consumers and to citizens. In areas like health and human services, however, people are understandably concerned that the inappropriate use of data analytics by governments and public sector agencies can compromise sensitive information, reinforce and exacerbate existing social inequalities and create new ones, and potentially do more harm than social good. So can we put people at the centre of public sector data analytics so that we realise the promise of new and emerging methods while also effectively managing and mitigating the risks? In tonight's lecture, we'll find out the answer to this question. Professor Rhema Vaithianathan, as I've said, is Professor of Economics at Auckland University of Technology, Director of the Centre for Social Data Analytics there, Professor of Social Data Analytics here at ISSR. She's also the Director of the Singapore Life Panel at Singapore Management University. So there are actually three Rhemas, not one, but the secret of how we make that work is not one we're going to share with you tonight. Rhema is internationally recognised for implementing machine learning tools in high-stakes government systems such as child welfare. Her work has been published in top journals and profiled in the New York Times and Nature, among other places. Her methods to screening child abuse calls using machine learning tools are also being adopted internationally. She's frequently invited to speak to government agencies, researchers and practitioners around the world about the ethical use of these technologies. She's held research positions in Australia, Singapore and the United States, including a Harkness Fellowship at Harvard University. So tonight, Rhema's going to talk about her own experiences in implementing the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, which is a tool that she is probably most internationally well known for. This is a child welfare decision support tool that's currently being used and evaluated in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania in the UA, in Pittsburgh. Rhema's at the forefront of international research in this area, and you'll hear why tonight. So after the lecture, there'll be an opportunity to ask Rhema some questions, and I hope also that you will be able to stay and join us for the reception, which will be downstairs. But for the moment, would you please join me in welcoming Professor Rhema Vaithianathan.
Thank you. It's so lovely to see so many people here, and I see people like this on a 5:30 on a Monday evening. Or Wednesday evening. I feel like I should take a photo and send it to my students because some of them can't be bothered coming to my lectures. I want to show them how many people are willing to come in the evenings. And I promise not to mention strategic planning at all in my lecture. And it's really great to see an audience like this interested in this work. The journey I'm going to take you on today is probably one that many of us who have worked with data analytics in the public sector have asked ourselves at some time or another. The public sector deals with such huge intractable problems, protecting children from abuse and neglect, managing and safely reducing incarceration rates, trying to get health services out to regional and rural communities. We have huge problems in the public sector, and we seem to have amazing technology in the private sector for getting pizzas to us on time, managing to get us from point A to point B on amazing digital platforms. Why can't we harness some of that private sector technology and use it to address these big social problems? Why can't the public sector be more like the private sector? And in this talk, I try to convince you, and really I'm trying to convince myself as well, that the public sector is really taking the long game. It's actually the tortoise in the parable of the tortoise and the hare, and that it will eventually come out of its shell and win the race to use machine learning, artificial intelligence in a way that addresses our problems. Let's see how well I convince myself and convince you, the audience. Clearly in this narrative, Clearly in this narrative, the private sector is the hare. So let's see how early and how well the private sector adapted these technologies. These are just a few examples. It's really the years that are most striking here. It's more than 20 years ago when Amazon.com launched its item-based collaborative filtering. Simple way of saying that is basically it's a filtering tool that enables recommendations to be personalized at unseen scale across millions of users and millions of items. So that when Amazon users were browsing for books, the recommendations that they received on another book that they might like was totally customized to their click history. A couple of years later, Google rolled out an advanced auction system allowing advertisers to bid for search words that would be used for product placement. And it wasn't just digital platforms like Facebook and Google who were getting in on the use of data analytics, machine learning tools. Even bricks and mortar companies like Walmart were using advanced machine learning to predict and coordinate the stock requirements of thousands of Walmart firms and businesses across the whole of the US. Facebook, not one to be left out, allowed advertisers to use their data to micro-target consumers, not just based on consumer tastes like advertisers had done before, but based on personality, on hobbies, on even religious inclination. Thousands of data points were now available to advertisers so they could make incredibly accurate and targeted advertising to Facebook users and platform users. They had an intimate portrayal of their customer like they'd never had before. And of course, we know that this was a huge part of driving profits in both digital platforms and bricks and mortar. Walmart was recording huge profitable increases, and we think those are because of how quickly and early they adopted some of these methods. We all know how huge the initial public offerings were for Facebook and Google. They broke records in how much market valuation they had on the day that they floated. So So this kind of adoption was really led by some comparative advantage that the private sector had. And I've been thinking about what that could be, and I've sort of focused on 4 distinct comparative advantages that I think the private sector used in order to accelerate so quickly and so far with data analytics and machine learning. Well, first was just a brilliant discovery that consumers were willing to give up their data in exchange for free stuff, for dodgy personality quizzes, for free Wi-Fi at an airport. All of these free things, these customer value, customers were willing to consent to have their data given the most intimate details of Facebook posts in exchange for customer value. So that was a brilliant discovery by our private sector, that really customers were very willing to give up their data. The second thing that I think businesses used was this idea that data is a strategic asset. It came, the strongest sort of statement of this was the front cover of The Economist magazine last year, which had prominently placed an oil pump and the statement, "Data is the new oil." So there was this conception in the private sector that if you were not extracting value from your data, you were going to go out of business. That was what you were supposed to do, and that's what they did. So this led to the rise in the end-to-end data business that ingested data from other businesses and produced intelligence. For example, I don't know if anyone here is from Brisbane City. Is anyone here from Brisbane City Council? Well, think about this. There's a data analyst sitting at head office in Uber right now who knows more about the commuting patterns of Brisbane residents than you know at Brisbane City. You know what? In sometime very soon, Uber's going to offer to sell you that data. And they're going to give you an offer you can't refuse. So there was an idea that these end-to-end data businesses were really capturing this incredibly valuable data that they were then going to be able to share with others and make a business out of it. The final advantage, I think, is the amazing seamlessness of these ML and AI tools. For many Amazon users, for a very long time, did not realize that these startlingly predictive books that they were being recommended was actually customized to them. They just thought it was amazing that they logged on to Amazon and they were being offered these products that they remarkably wanted to buy. Because there wasn't anything clunky about it. It's not one minute you were sort of you were interacting with a very generalized Amazon platform, and the next minute you were in the bit that was really targeted to you. You were sort of moving between highly targeted, customized machine learning type offerings and to the general platform where everyone saw the same thing. So, as I said, now let's turn to the public sector, and I'm going to try to convince you that the public sector is the tortoise. He's the hero of our story. But to be honest, it's a bloody hard road to hoe, because they aren't looking all that flash right now. So here's a potted history, very partial and prejudiced history, my own history, my personal kind of observations of some attempts by the public sector to use machine learning and data analytics. So the thing I'd like you to note is that unlike the private sector, where most of those use cases were from 2 decades ago, these are all in the last decade. So we're already behind in terms of how fast we're going. So probably the earliest one is the Compass tool in 1998, which was used to try and predict which defendants are most likely to re-offend and so should not be given bail. And so that compass tool was being used by judges all around the US to try to help them identify people who were standing in front of them who they might want to deny bail to. The NHS PAR tool was a readmission tool that was, I did quite a bit of research on that in the mid-2000s. So that was just a tool that helped hospitals in the NHS in the UK tell them which patient was most likely to be readmitted in the next 6 months to try to help prevent those readmissions. Now, the need prediction tool has been in New Zealand for the last 5 years, and basically that's a tool which stratifies students at high school to predict who is most likely to end up not in employment, education, or training. That's what NEET stands for. So you can imagine high school students are being risk scored to say which of them will basically end up on the benefit. And they're being given job support to try to get them to a job rather than on the benefit. I'm sure most of you know robo-debt, so I won't bring up that sad and the history of, not actually a history, the current use of linked data between tax authorities and welfare data in order to identify beneficiaries who are claiming when they ought not to be. And German hospitals around 2017 tried to use Ibm Watson. Now, IBM invested millions, if not billions, in a product called Watson, which was an advanced artificial intelligence product, which was going to be their big seller. As part of their attempt to show hospitals that this was going to work, they worked with a couple of German hospitals to help the clinicians use this AI tool to help diagnose especially rare conditions. So what happened to this? The majority of these cases have been mired in controversy or simply not useful. The Compass tool was reviewed by ProPublica, which is a news organization, a couple of years ago. The ProPublica piece on the Compass tool is a seminal piece of journalistic research around algorithms. It broke the floodgates on the research of how racist and racially discriminatory and biased some of these tools appear to be. Now, I say appear because there are lots of things in that ProPublica piece I actually don't agree with, but certainly when you took it at face value, it seemed like the Compass tool was incredibly racially biased. The NHS readmission tool was simply cancelled for just the uptake was rather poor. You know, robo-debt is being litigated again and again, and the Watson tool was cancelled with clinicians saying that even a first-year medical student could make better predictions than the Watson tool. So why is it so hard in the public sector? And so I've tried to reflect on why I think not just these, but my history with the public sector has been so challenging and difficult. Well, first of all, many of the use cases in the public sector are incredibly high stakes. They're high stakes, high risk with low consumer value. For the Compass tool, the recidivism tool that tries to see if someone's going to re-offend if they're given bail, if that tool gets it wrong, what's going to happen? Well, let me tell you what happened, because that's what happened in San Francisco. In San Francisco, a recidivism tool got it wrong. A man was let out on bail. Within days, he had gone and murdered a tourist who was taking photos of the Golden Bridge. It had got it wrong because it had failed to account for history that the tool simply hadn't seen in the data. So there was some problem with entity resolution and it had missed history. So much of government data use is unconsented. It's unlikely that any of the students in the high schools in New Zealand who are being risk stratified, for the chances that there are going to be needs, know what need is, know that the data is being used for that purpose, or even know that they're being stratified in that way. I'm sure you know the issues with robo-debt and, so the second issue that I think we need to understand with the public sector is the public sector, citizens, communities are much less comfortable with full end-to-end automation. They always want what's called human in the loop. Human in the loop is the idea that between the machine and the decision, there should always be a person. As flawed as that person is, we should have a person. When you think about the flack over robo-debt, well, for years we've been linking tax data with benefit data to find out whether there are people who are claiming benefits when they're also being seen to have income in the tax system. But most of those years, we had a Centrelink officer who made the decision about whether to send a letter, whether to investigate that case or not. The backlash for robo-debt really, to my assessment, started when we missed that worker and the letters just got automatically sent out from the algorithm. But if there's a human in the loop, there is also the problem of transparency and explainability. Humans want to not just be given a recommendation from an algorithm, they want to know why. They want explainability, they want transparency. And if you look at the failure and the repeated failure, I think, of decision support tools, including Watson and lots of other AI attempts in health, it is simply that reason. The clinician wants to know why. And algorithms are very poor at giving the kind of malleable form of human explanation. Algorithms can be trained to give something that looks like explanations, but not the type of malleable, human-centered explanation that people are looking for when they are a human in the loop. So, the statement, the public sector should be more like the private sector, well, that's the statement that I'll come to now. But I want to tell you that actually there's a problem, and that's controversial as well. I have to give you a personal story about this. My unease about what the private sector was doing actually dates back a few years now. I, along with other data for social good researchers from around the world, were invited to the headquarters of a large social media provider in Silicon Valley, who I shall not name. They were pitching to us their data about how they could use their data for our social good projects. On the surface, this seemed like an awesome opportunity, but it made me distinctly queasy. They were treating data from millions of users as if it was their data, to use as they willed. I couldn't believe it, and frankly, I didn't want to be anywhere near this company when the train crashed. I legged it from their headquarters as fast as my bright orange Segway could take me. It didn't surprise me when a couple of years later, a scandal broke that showed that there was something rotten in the state of Denmark. Many of you in the audience would be well aware of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Basically, Facebook allowed Cambridge Analytica, a voter profiling company, to extract data from around 50 million Facebook users. The genius of Cambridge Analytica is that when the Facebook user consented to having their data extracted, the firm was able to not just extract that Facebook user's data, but Facebook users' friends and contacts data. So in that way, they were able to extract a lot more data than had been theoretically consented. This data allowed the company to exploit the private social media activity of the American electorate to help, according to some reports, but to be honest, political scientists dispute whether this was effective, but according to some reports, they really worked to help the Trump administration win the election. Even 300,000 Australians, Facebook data was extracted as part of that. When the Facebook scandal broke, $24.5 billion was lost in the market valuation of Facebook. That's when the private sector suddenly took notice and thought, man, this stuff is real. Ethics is real. Community comfort's real. All this stuff really matters because it's going to cost a lot of money. But the striking thing is what I saw when I went to visit that social media site is what you also observe when you hear the voices of the Cambridge Analytica people who were involved at the time. A beautiful quote from one of the founders of the tool says, honestly, we thought we were acting perfectly appropriately. We thought we were doing something that was really normal. And to be honest, they were doing something pretty normal. They had got consent from users for their data. Facebook had asked all those users to sign some kind of consent that allowed them to share with third parties. And Cambridge Analytica is not alone in its scandals. Google, with all its billions of dollars and millions of smart brains, decided we can fix this problem. The problem is a lack of trust in social media data use. What we'll do is we will appoint a world-class Google ethics, AI in ethics committee. And they did that. Within a week, that committee was dissolved. Front page of New York Times, ethics committee all walk out. So they apparently, Google, quote, is back to the drawing board on this. So for all its money, all its brains, the private sector could not fix this problem. It's living with it today. YouTube apparently has a similar problem. Early people who work with YouTube claim that its curation algorithm drives people to more and more extreme sites. So it drives extremism. So what went wrong with the private sector? Well, my theory is that what went wrong with the private sector is actually the strengths that I told you about before. So my argument is that the list of strengths turned out not to be such great strengths at all. For example, for so long they had relied on this idea of user consent. But what we see with the Cambridge Analytica scandal is that it's not just users that caused the backlash, it was a community backlash. And so when you get consent from individualized users, that does not equal to consent from the community. And we are starting to call this a social license to operate. It's more than getting just single user consent, it's understanding how the community of people affected by what you're doing with data, how they feel about it, how comfortable they are. The Economist headline claiming data is the new oil is, I think, exactly what went wrong. Data, at least data from Facebook posts, could not be further from oil. They are intimate, heartfelt outpouring of people They are declarations of love, they are celebrations of life, they are sharing of grief. This might look like data to people, but there's a world of difference between Facebook posts and purchasing click history on Amazon. And what they didn't understand is that both of these look like data from a data science point of view, but from the community's point of view, they look mightily different. And other problems I think that Cambridge Analytica scandal has shown us is that when people built these end-to-end data businesses, they assumed they had data rights as third parties, and they do not. People, and we have done a lot of work in this, people are not comfortable having their data sent to third parties, and private sector has not got its head around that yet. And the fact that we had seamless AI machine learning tools, well, that starts to look like opacity and not transparency. So the fact that your people didn't know that their Facebook feeds are being curated because of a personality typology that has been placed upon them, that became a problem. So this is where I come to what I call the data science conundrum. The fact that we can do amazing things with data, but the real question is, should we? How am I doing for time, Mark? You good? Okay. So now I want to come to some of the work that we've been doing at the Centre for Social Data Analytics, where we've been using some of these tools for very high stakes decisions and in a very sensitive and delicate area, which is in child abuse protection. And the tool that I'm going to talk to you about, I'm going to talk about two tools that we built. One is called the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, and the other is called the California Prototype. So the Allegheny Family Screening Tool was built using data from Allegheny County, which is the county associated with the city of Pittsburgh. The problem that we're trying to solve with this tool is the fact that every year in the US, there are around 3.6 million calls of referrals of child abuse and neglect. That is from the community, from school teachers, from doctors. These are sometimes called abuse hotline calls. So the county has its thousands of calls every year that it has to triage. Triaging these calls are basically taking the call and deciding whether you're going to investigate that call or whether you're going to do what's called screening out, which is you'll never do anything else. Now, I have sat in those call screening places, and believe you and me, every call I got, I'm in the car and I'm going out. But you can't go out on 3.6 million calls a year. So, on average, in the US, around half the calls are left, and half the calls are gone out on. But it's this huge number of calls which lead to this startling number. 1 in 3 American children will be investigated for abuse and neglect before they turn 18. 1 in 3. And before we start getting to, that's the US about it, the number for New Zealand is about 1 in 5, and I can't find numbers for Australia, but 1 in 5 children will be referred in South Australia to child abuse and neglect before they turn 18. And to be honest, if no one in this room has been referred to child abuse and neglect, it's because we know there are communities out there where everyone is being referred to child abuse hotlines. So this is a major problem. How can we safely reduce the amount of investigations, the burden of investigations we make on families? The other side of this problem is the converse. Half the children who come in with a critical abuse injury or death, half of them have never touched the child abuse system, have never been investigated. So what does this tell you? There's two problems happening. We are for sure as hell over investigating. 1 in 3 do not need investigation, and we're probably leaving a lot of calls uninvestigated who need to be investigated. This is an acknowledged problem in the US, which is only sort of, with research we have done, has started to kind of resonate with the community. It's been work done by us, by Chris Wilderman. There's a whole lot of researchers out there now who are trained to make this claim that we do have this incredibly high rate of maltreatment investigations when you look at it from this cumulative point of view. So, how does the AFSD work? Well, the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, when a call comes in, it harvests data from multiple data systems, and then it drives a score which is available for the frontline worker. Now, there is definitely a human in the loop, because the frontline worker who decides on investigation or not can make that decision regardless of the score. Their score is just one piece of information. They are able to interrogate all these individual data sets themselves. They have always been able to do that in Allegheny, and this extra piece of data just helps to improve, or they can use the data, that score, if they want. What does the score say? The score is from 1 to 20, and it gives the likelihood that a child on the referral will have an out-of-home placement in 2 years. So how well does the score predict? Well, this is data that we run through the algorithm. It's historical data, so we could follow that data. It was not data used to build the algorithm, it was kept aside. And what we did is we followed those kids based on what the score the algorithm had given them. The height of the column tells you what percentage of the children who receive their score end up removed. So when you look at a score of 20, about half the children end up removed in the next 2 years. When you look at a score of 1, less than 1% end up being removed in the next 2 years. Now this is accurate or not accurate enough, depending on what you're doing now. So what we also discovered is that a third of the children who received a score of 20 had been screened out previously. More compellingly, 25% of the kids who were scored a 1 had been investigated. And yet when we followed them through the investigation right to the end of 2 years, they had never been removed. Most of the times no cases had been found. So then we built also a California prototype tool. This is an attempt to see if we can do what we've done in Allegheny with less data. So remember, in Allegheny, we're drawing on all these different databases, that because Allegheny is what's called an integrated health and human system, has access to linked administrative data. In California, we only have one data system, and that's child welfare data. But it's state level, so we have millions of observations. And in fact, in California, you see a very similar pattern. In California, we scored from 1 to 10. Sorry, I should have told you, the way the scoring works in both Allegheny and here is that each of these buckets are the same size of number of calls. So 10% of the calls will get a score of 10, 10% of the calls will get a score of 1. So if you look at they're basically deciles. The top decile, around 59% of them end up being removed, whereas if you look at the bottom decile, less than 1% end up being removed. So this is just using one data system and less so. What we find, remarkably, is that this prediction really only uses one database, but because we have such huge amount of data in the state of California, it kind of swamps the richness, or lack of richness in the features. So the other thing we discovered, which I want to share with you, is that when we looked at what we were doing with these children right now, more than 50% of the kids who had scored a low score were being investigated. And the difference was Black and Hispanic children who scored a low score were more likely to be investigated than white children who scored a low score. So what does that tell us? It tells us that right across that when the call screener sees color, they are possibly seeing risk where there is no risk. So these scores could potentially modulate the statistical discrimination that all humans are prone to, which is they see what's in front of them and try to make a risk assessment. The other thing we were able to do with California, because the data is so large, is we were able to ask, even though this algorithm was trained for removals, to predict removals, removal from the home, that is, the child is at risk, we have to remove them, was it also sensitive to maltreatment death? Which is really so removals are a proxy outcome for the thing that we're really concerned with, which is we're trying to protect children from maltreatment-related critical events and death. And we found that it was. So the way this graph works is on the left-hand side, you can see every bar is the same height, because by definition, children are scored, 10% of children score a 1, 10% of children score a 2, 10% of children score a 10. So on the left in grey are all the children who didn't die of maltreatment deaths. On the right are the subgroup of children who died or were almost injured of a critical maltreatment event and who we happen to have scored. So what do you see on the right-hand side? You see that almost 75% of kids who end up dying in the state would have, if they had been scored a 9 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10 at some point. So what this tells us, and we've done this work with hospitalization as well in Allegheny, and we've done this with New Zealand data as well. In New Zealand, we've shown that if you address the top 10% of children who are scored in an algorithm, you will capture 50% of all maltreatment-related deaths in that cohort. So we are really, these algorithms are trained for something, are being shown to be very sensitive for the actual objective harm that the outcome that they're trained for is actually a proxy for. So just to make sure that we could convince ourselves this was true, we did the following, which is kind of a counterfactual. We took the children who had also died, but had died of cancer deaths. So if our tool was sensitive to maltreatment deaths, but should not be sensitive to cancer deaths, and you see exactly the same pattern as you saw in the grey data. That is, children in our data set who died of cancer, when we went back and saw what they scored, they almost scored uniformly between 1 and 10. When we looked at children who had died of maltreatment and we went back and scored them, they had died much more disproportionately. They would have scored a 9 or 10. So this comes back to the question, we can do amazing things with data, but should we? And so for the next, how many minutes do I have? 10 minutes, okay. The next 10 minutes, I'm going to just sketch out how we went about answering the question and addressing how should we decide what we do. And when I reflect, I think there are 6 kind of elements that we have brought together in all the projects that we have now done. That's agency leadership, transparency and fairness, a commitment to community voice and engagement, multidisciplinary teams, an independent ethical review, and an independent evaluation. So these are some headshots of the wonderful leaders in Allegheny County. And this project, and projects like it we have done in other parts of the world, have very much been led by good leadership in agencies, because at the end of the day, the agency is not fetishized. I think sometimes we fetishize these data algorithms and so on. The agency doesn't care about your algorithms. They're trying to keep their children safe. And they can speak to their community and unapologetically about the fact that they are trying to address their problem. And this research project or this data science project is simply one of the ways in which they can try to do that. So that's a very important voice, and a leading voice is to have the agency describe the problem they're trying to solve and why they think that this might be a solution. And if it ain't the solution, Rhema's on her bike and we're going to try the next solution. The other thing that we really support is a multidisciplinary team. So this, I'm sorry, the print is rather small, but basically the team that we have brought together around the Allegheny project includes researchers in fairness and disparities, researchers in ethics, actual ethicists, senior professor in very critical voices in social work who came together to write an independent ethics review, an independent evaluator. And so I must say, when I hear of agencies, which I do now sometimes in the US, who are wanting to do this work just all in-house, I really don't understand how they can bring a team like this together all within their agency. So I really find it quite confusing how agencies around the world are trying to do this kind of high-stakes algorithm implementation projects all on their own. So the other commitment we've had is to transparency and fairness. And being open means we've put up on the website our full methodology report. We update that when we change our algorithm. It also actually means being honest about what we got wrong. So the paper on the left-hand side is a paper we presented at the FATML conference in 2018, outlining how we had actually got some stuff wrong, including some technical pieces. And that actually won the best paper award at that conference, because people really appreciate that this stuff is super hard to get right, but we're kind of, I always say, if you can't be right, be honest. So being honest, right, building in transparency is so important. We've also always advocated for an independent ethics review. So we had an ethicist and a professor of social work at University of Auckland and University of California, Berkeley, do an independent assessment. That too is on the website. The Allegheny County response to that independent ethics report is on the website. So they basically concluded that in their assessment, subject to the recommendations in the report, the implementation is ethically appropriate. Indeed, they went on to say, we believe that there is a significant ethical issue in not using the most accurate predictive risk measure. So that was kind of a statement saying that if we have this technology and we can safely deploy it, turning away from it is actually got ethical implications. The other thing we've done a lot of work in, and I have to put my hand up, I have had to be drawn kicking and screaming to this, which is kind of co-design sessions, which is community engagement, participatory design, participatory democracy. The first meeting I had in Pittsburgh was in a room like this, smaller than this, and in the room were basically families who had their children removed, young adults who'd aged out of the foster care system, and I walked them through how an algorithm predictive risk model works, what our findings are, and why I think that it could be worth a shot. And a man in the audience stood up and said, I'm in your data, I have extensive substance abuse history, but I'm actually recovering, I'm in recovery. So your algorithm is going to score me a 20 and never let me get my kids back. Very good, fair point, right? That is the dilemma that we have, is how do we bring in those human judgments? And so one thing that Allegheny was very clear about is the algorithm will never make a decision. It will always be intercepted by a human who will help mediate between that piece of information and what they see in front of them, which is someone who has done a lot of work in recovering. We also had an independent evaluation from colleagues at Stanford, and they basically concluded that the implementation of the Allegheny Family Screening Tool increased the accurate identification of children who needed further services without increasing workload of investigation. The other thing they found is that the Allegheny Family Screening Tool reduced racial disparities in case openings. Before the tool, black case opening rates were much higher than white case opening rates. After the tool was implemented, those case opening rates fell to almost the same. So these elements that I've talked about have come together to give us, by and large, a fairly positive profile. So the New York Times did a very in-depth piece on our work. Basically their reporter was embedded with us for almost a year. And they came out in a very positive way, simply because they found it really hard to talk to anyone in the community who hadn't heard about this project and felt like their voices had not been heard. So they really struck a chord with me, is that one of the things when these sorts of projects are done is you want everyone to feel that this is not coming out of the blue. This is something that communities have been engaged with for many years. So, we've had a lot of algorithm transparency in the city, reviewed, I think, around 40 algorithm users in public sector in the US, and found our one was the only one that they thought came close to being an open source one. So we've been incredibly open and transparent and honest. And I think what we've tried to model is we can do amazing things with data. How should we do those things? So the lessons, I hope I've convinced you, I think I've convinced myself, is that the public sector can really lead the way because they haven't rushed to adoption. They've been incredibly measured, incredibly careful. And so they can lead the way by adopting what we've started to call a human-centered approach in data science. What next for us is we have multiple collaborations across the world using our approach and trying to address the similar problems of abuse and neglect, including in Denmark, in South America, and other parts of the US. What next for Australia? I really think Australia too could be a real forerunner for this kind of work. I think the ACCC Digital Platforms report was a really good example of how Australia can come out in a much more proactive way and try to lead the world in the conversations around AI. And I hope that Australia also takes the opportunity to lead and model what really good use of this new technology looks like for health and human services. So I just wanted to acknowledge the Center for Social Data Analytics, the Children's Data Network at USC, and in particular my close collaborator, Emily Putnam-Hornstein at USC, and Erin Dalton, who's the Director of Data Analytics at Allegheny. Thank you.